the moor.
Hey everybody, Matt and Tom back with you. Welcome to the dark side of the moor. Well, you may recognise where we are. We are in Manchester, but the story we're looking at today, it goes back to a time when Manchester would look very, very different. Now, this is a Tom story, so I'm going to disappear off camera. So I'll say see you soon, and I'll leave you in some very capable hands.
So, in late February 1889, John Fletcher, a businessman formerly from Bolton, who had been recently widowed. He hadn't been married very long, mind. He was 50, and he married later in life to a lady who was also later in life. And he was out, quite a drinker, liker of gin was John Fletcher, and he was out in Manchester. He'd been working at one of his offices, which is suddenly under Market Street now, and then he decided to come to an auction which was being held here at the Mitre Hotel for a paper mill. There he was seen to be not drunk, but having a convivial afternoon, and he put in a bid. Didn't get accepted. Anyway, afterwards he was due to go and meet some friends at Sinclair's Oyster Bar, which was not there. It's over there. We'll do more of that in a minute. Sinclair's Oyster Bar. In between the Mitre and Sinclair's Oyster Bar, on some steps, he encountered a young man, a man called Charles Parton. From there, he gets in a cab, horse-drawn cab, between 1889, and off they set to our next location, the Three Arrows on Deansgate. Or is it Mary? So, Charles Parton was an 18-year-old lad. He'd been born in 1871 or 72 in Liverpool, and not long after he was born, his family moved to Salford, to the Greengate area, which is not far over the river that way. And his father was a boxer, and had once been called the 9'4" champion of England. And yeah, he was quite a well-known boxer. In fact, a few years earlier he'd been asked not to box again because he was too old, they decided. But anyway, he had 3 sons, I think 6 children in total, but 3 sons, and they were all very big boxers. And Charles Parton had gone out to America. He'd also, where he boxed, and it hadn't gone very well. He'd lasted about 3 months in America before coming back. And so he was 18. He'd worked as well in a hotel in Manchester, and that perhaps is where he knew Fletcher from. He'd worked as a bellboy, and it was surmised that perhaps Charles Parton, the 18-year-old, knew John Fletcher somewhat, because it seems quite insane that he could entice a man he didn't really know, who was so much older than him, to come down to our next location and drink whiskey with him into the night. So, behind us is our next location. Now that looks to me like the House of Fraser building in Manchester on Deansgate, but in 1889 it was Wood Street underneath there somewhere, and there was a pub in Wood Street called the Three Arrows. Now, it's not actually very far from Sinclair's Oyster Bar, so Charles Parton, 18, meets John Fletcher, 50, and says, "Come with me in this horse-drawn cab," owned by Tommy Robinson. And they
Not
come
that
off, not that one, no. And they head off to here, Wood Street, the Three Arrows pub. And Charles Parton says to Tommy, wait here for me." So he does, and they go into the Three Arrows pub. Now it's a very quiet pub, and there's only about 5 people in, so they were noticed. The landlady serves them 2 halves, or quarts even, of beer. Someone notices that a little bottle of what appears to be a medicine of some kind is poured into one of the halves. But then there must have been a switch, because that was the half of Charles Parton. John Fletcher suddenly ends up very, very, very drunk, and within moments is ushered by Charles Parton into the cab that's still waiting for them. Charles Parton then gives an address on Stretford Road of a tailor's, but there doesn't seem to be any link to it. On the way there, they're heading down Deansgate, as you can see in the background, and there's a Mexican circus on. So the cab driver has to get off and walk the horse. At some point he gets back on the horse, and a lady comes up and says, "Do you know your cab door's open?" And there is Mr. Fletcher, stumped over. Later on that evening, when Mr. John Fletcher was taken to the Royal Infirmary in Manchester, they found that he'd lost his gold chain and his gold watch and had been relieved of a certain amount of sovereigns. The whole amount would have got about £120, which was a heck of a lot of money in 1889. Anyway, Mr. Fletcher unfortunately passed away, and Charles Parton was nowhere to be seen. But Caminada had a few things to go on. So Caminada was a very important inspector at the time, and he managed to track down Parton to his father's house very quickly. Inspector Caminada didn't have much to go on, but what he did have to go on was two previous victims of Charles Parton and his chloral hydrate. The first one was a greengrocer, Samuel Oldfield, about 50 years old, a bachelor, from Ashton-under-Lyme. He'd been out on the town in Manchester at a pub that we're going to go and look at the site of. One night in January, Samuel Oldfield, a greengrocer, was drinking in the Blue Boar, which was off Blue Boar Court, which is now underneath Harvey Nicks. He was sat there, and for 3/4 of an hour he was on his own. Suddenly he was accosted by this young man, Charles Parton, who offered to buy him some whiskey. He did this, and they stayed drinking with Charles Parton, the 18-year-old, buying him drink all through the night until 11:30. Which was about 5 hours later, and they were thrown out into the night. At this point, Mr. Oldfield became very, very, very violently sick and was in Blue Boar Court, throwing up and being very ill. He was ushered into a cab and there taken towards the Cheshire Cheese pub.
Oh wow.
Somewhere on the way, Mr. Parton, who had ordered the cab, jumped out of the cab and leaving Mr. Oldfield semi-conscious in the back. The cab driver thought Mr. Oldfield was just drunk and took him to the Royal Infirmary. To the police station, and the police took him to the Royal Infirmary, where they found that no, he had in fact been drugged, and he'd also lost a gold chain and a watch.
Okay, so just very quickly before we finish, I'm sorry it's been so noisy in this video. I mean, almost every location we've gone to, all of a sudden there's been bells ringing, there's been alarms going off, there's been tons of people. So I hope you've been able to hear us okay.
Breaches.
Yeah, indeed. We've had everything. Anyway, we're going to our next location now.
Late December 1888, John Parquet, a railway porter from Ashton-under-Lyme, and his friend Thomas Coxon, who I believe lived in Ancoats area of Manchester, are out on the lash. They've been at the Wheat Sheaf, which was underneath the old Cardoma at Piccadilly in Manchester, and they've come out of there and they've run into two young men who they've never met before, the two Parton brothers. These two, railway porter and his friend, they're not particularly much older than them. I think they're in their 20s, but they run into these two complete strangers, and somehow these strangers within seconds convince them to come to this pub, the Crown and Anchor, as you do with random people you've never met before. Whereupon the two Parton brothers try and buy the other two a lot of whiskey. One of the Parton brothers takes Thomas Coxon away at some point to a pub called the Windmill, which is just over there somewhere. And then they return. When they return to find Charles Parton, the 18-year-old who had later on done Fletcher, they find John Parquet absolutely stupefied. And when they get him home in a cab to Thomas Coxon's house, they find that he's lost his wallet and his watch and his gold chain. And yes, he was again chloral done in that pub there in the Snug, you see. And Charles Parton got away with the two before, but when Caminada put all these evidences of the witnesses together, he found very quickly that Charles Parton was the chap for him. So Charles Parton, 18, was found guilty of willful murder of John Fletcher, aged 50, by drugging and robbing, and he was sentenced to be executed. However, the Home Secretary reprieved him and decided to put him away for life at Dartmouth. So he went off to Dartmouth for 20 years, because that was what life was then. He did 11, got out on good behaviour, came straight back home to Manchester. Here's his brother is in trouble in Hull, hot-foots it to Hull, where he meets a woman called Mary Smith, a likely name indeed. And on the very same evening that he's released from Manchester into Hull, he manages with this Mary Smith to steal a watch and a chain of a gentleman called William Hickling in Hull. And anyway, he goes back to Dartmouth, I think for 10 days, after which he joins the army. And then in 1915, when he's 44, he comes out and he marries a 15-year-old girl in Bath, as you do in those days. And they have, I think, 9 children together from about 1920 on till about 1930 something, maybe 20 something. And he lives a great amount of time. He's constantly being done for robbing little old ladies or using obscenities in the street. Eventually he writes a pamphlet in 1926 saying about how much terrible the prison service is. So, some priests hear about this down in Sussex, and they decide to let him be their gardener. So they move him and his wife and his 9 children off down to be a gardener, and he lives out his days there. Of course, him and his wife separate when she goes off with someone much younger. He assaults her in the street, gets into trouble for that. Then he takes on a housekeeper who brings her 3 daughters. He doesn't like that, gets jealous of them, and Canadian soldiers in the town, because this is 1940 something or other. And so he stabs one of them in the cheek to make her ugly. Yes, a truly interesting man, Charles Parton, and he died aged 77 on the Sussex coast somewhere. So if you're ever in Hastings, have a look, see if you can find it.
Okay guys, there we are. That is the story of the teenage poisoner of Manchester, Charlie Parton. Thank you so much. What a great story. Anything to add?
No, it's a grim bit of Victorian history of Manchester.
And we have plenty more Victorian era crime stories to come. So we've been doing quite a lot of research, so we'll see what else we come and film in the weeks ahead. Okay, take care guys, and we will see you very soon.
At the end of December, John Parquet, a porter from Ashton, and Samuel Oldfield was sat drinking in a pub behind me, which is now underneath Harvey Nicks. One night in January, Samuel Oldfield, a greengrocer, was drinking in the Blue Boar, which was off Blue Boar Court, which is now underneath Harvey Nicks. We couldn't film in there. We didn't ask. And his brother, another Parton brother.
See what I mean about the noise?
Lovely, isn't it?